Much, Ernesto, and thank you, Ina, for the lovely invitation. Thanks all of you for coming. And I especially want to thank Bill Phelan at the Institute for all the logistical help, as well as Mavis Amador and Thea Marks. It's been a really welcoming experience, so thank you all. Yes, as Ernesto said, I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about an article that I published in March out of this issue, which I'll be talking about in more detail. And like many historical projects, there is the history that's recounted in the article itself, but there's also the history behind the article. And in this particular case, it's relevant in ways that perhaps Ernesto had already alluded to, but it will also, I think, become increasingly apparent both in terms of the motivation for writing this piece and the method and process for doing so. Ernesto mentioned that I do give a lot of interviews, have a public profile, which as an historian perhaps would be a little bit strange, right? Because in terms of thinking about current events, people don't often resort to historians. But that's in fact been a lot of my profile. I began, when I began studying Venezuela, I did so when I was in grad school in the year 2000. And my very first public talk, which was in 2001, was titled Venezuela in Crisis. And so, this is back in 2001. And it feels like a lot of my career has really been a kind of variation on that theme, right? Every couple of years, there's like Venezuelan crisis, Venezuelan crisis, Venezuelan. The nature of the crisis changes, but the idea of it remains. And in my own professional work, as well as public engagement, really it's an attempt to try to make sense, not of the crisis of the moment, but rather the long gestating structural conditions that have led to Venezuela being in this seeming state of perpetual upheaval, perpetual unrest. And so I am Venezuelan myself, and so the work has both a professional kind of inclination, but also a deeply personal one, which is important to understand because part of what I wanted to do in this particular piece, and really the larger sweep of my my professional career, is to try to not break through or break past, but to try to make sense of what has really become the primary feature of Venezuelan life history of politics over the last 20, 25 years, which is deep, intense polarization, which affects every facet of life, which affects every facet of interpretation and analysis. And as an historian, again, my major task, certainly in this piece, but in all of my work, has been, is it possible to write histories, not just of polarization, but in polarization? And is it possible to do so while these histories remain unfinished, right? We might think about it in the contemporary context, for instance, the United States. How might you write a history of the last 20 years of the United States, right? Is it possible to do that? Is this the terrain of political science? Is it the terrain of sociology? What is the task or role or potential of an historian in bringing to bear changes over time, processes, et cetera, that could lay bare and expose perhaps some of the continuities rather than some of the ruptures that otherwise might structure the way that we think about the stakes of the present. And so this is really what I wanted to do in this particular piece, which is basically to lean into the polarization that has really captivated and captured, I guess is the better word, Venezuelan discussion over the last 25 years, and to do so in a way that that doesn't try to suggest that there is an easy way or path out, but that tries to model what this might look like. What might a history that both attends to the polarization, but tries to create an opportunity for engagement, understanding, what might that actually look like? Can history, therefore, contribute to depolarization? Often I tell my students that history is the first victim of polarization because it is the terrain on which assumptions, not only about the present, but about the reasons why the present exists for whatever side might be involved in the conflict, that's how they draw upon a legitimization that then structures a sense of identity, a sense of identity of the other, etc. And so the question is, can history actually contribute to depolarization? And I start from the premise that no history is ever objective, right? And no work of historical analysis is objective. History is by definition an interpretive field. And interpretation always implies choices. In every facet of the historical task, there is a work of choice making. when do you start a historical analysis? When you choose to start will already prefigure tremendously how you're going to approach whatever topic you're describing. How do you choose to end? Right? The arc of what you're describing will already imply choices that are not neutral, that are not objective. And of course, then there's all manner of questions about evidence, about framing, about weighing of multiple contradictory evidences within those structures. And so rather than suggesting that history has some sort of purchase in this task of depolarization by virtue of being somewhat objective or somehow objective, it's quite do the opposite, right? How do you lean into the polarization while at the same time understanding that that history is not an objective field? So with that in mind, in the summer of 2018, after I had published the book that Ernesto kindly mentioned, which tries to, in sort of modest ways, tell what I would like to describe as a prehistory of Chavismo. So it focuses on urban popular sectors, especially in Caracas, in the 40 years before Chavez was elected to office in 1998, as a way to think about where are some of the origins, the popular origins of Chavez and Chavismo that can help us explain the orientations of Chavismo once in power. And so once I wrote that book, I did a lot of talks thinking about, how can this work contribute to unpacking or entangling some of the deep entrenched polarization that Venezuela finds itself in. And to be perfectly frank, and I've talked about this with Irina in the past, in a way, it was a very dispiriting exercise. In multiplicity of fora, I've been called Nazi, I've been called fascist, I've been called, pinko communist, I've been called a CIA operative, and hopefully none of you will do that, although I'm happy to have retorts for all of them, well rehearsed. But it's a deeply intense kind of landscape and field that really makes it enervating to try to rise above. And so I felt really dispirited, and it struck me that perhaps a way to try to lean into that would be to tell a broader history, a comprehensive history of Chavismo that tried to bring together the multiple interpretations, but then also develop a narrative of its own. And so this is the context in which, in the summer of 2018, I was invited to write the Oxford Encyclopedia entry for Hugo Chavez and Chavismo, which when I first got the email, I'm like, stuff I got, I don't want to touch that with 10-foot pole. But then I realized actually that this is a really not only important opportunity, but really a necessary one. And so this got me to start thinking about, well, what would this look like? What work could I accomplish in doing this particular exercise? And so the first thing that I wanted was for a history that was comprehensive rather than episodic, which is to say, so much of what leads to a polarized interpretation of Venezuelan politics in the last 25 years is a sense of history as episodic. Like, Chavismo starts in 1999. Everything before that is either great or terrible. And then, there's a new period that starts very dramatically in 2002, and then a new one in 2006. So these episodes actually contribute to a sense of this splintering, but then makes very simple trying to craft linear narratives that actually do little in terms of explaining complexity. I also wanted it to be accessible, which is to say, confronting us with the challenge of how to write a comprehensive history that is accessible but non-linear, which is to say that, I think that we have an understanding of history as being quite narratively driven, but this narrative often makes difficult actually getting at nuance and complexity in ways that are otherwise intelligible in an easier way. So it does, trying to write accessibly about a depolarized history confronts us with the problem of contingency and contradiction. How do you write contingency and contradiction while at the same time, not discounting the narrative power of linearity? But mostly, I think the challenge is that I wanted it to be unfinished, or rather uncertain. And the reason why is quite contingent, which is to say, again, I had been invited to write this piece in 2018, and in 2019, in January, I went to Venezuela, and my aim there was to sort of craft it and really, create a first draft. And just as the time that I was there, Juan Guaido announced that he was going to be the interim president after, I'll talk about it in a minute, was a deeply contested, fraudulent presidential election in 2018. And so there was this real sense of like, I can't write this because I'm not sure what's going to happen. How do I know where to end? And if I don't know where to end, therefore, where do I find the signal posts that are going to allow me to craft this narrative? And so I realized that that was actually the wrong question. Where does it end is the wrong question in the context of depolarization or the attempt to do a depolarized history. Rather, the real question is, how do you write an unfinished history? And so that to me was deeply important in trying to think about this comprehensive account, one that doesn't lead to conclusions, but rather leads to questions, which was actually quite liberating exercise. So in this context, I started writing and quickly blew past the 10,000 word limit that the Oxford encyclopedias had given me. Also, given the various parameters that I just described, I realized that this is not the format or the place where I could have the kind of impact and usefulness that I really wanted to have with this particular piece. And so I had the opportunity to create this or to edit this special issue of the NACA report, which I'll happily circulate, which includes a range of voices, and the impetus behind the issue was revisiting Chavismo 20 years after the April 2002 coup, which was commemorated last April. And so this really became an exercise in doing precisely the kind of depolarizing work that I mentioned before. It brings together a range of voices in an effort to model a form of engagement that does not attempt to claim objectivity or equivalence, kind of both sidism, or even to claim conclusions, but rather privileges, contradiction, contingency, and ultimately incompleteness. Right? Those are the kind of the primary axes through which attempting a depolarized, approach or depolarizing approach might have approaches. And so that's the spirit of the piece that I wrote that's included in here, which eventually ended up going from, again, sort of 10,000 words to 30,000 words. So it's a longer piece than often is used for this kind of exercise. But it's really what I felt was required to get at the contingencies and complexities and inconclusiveness of this particular approach. And tries to get at the question, not just of Chavismo's past and present, but leave open the question of Chavismo's future. This is also, of course, a way for me to kind of cop out a little bit and say, in a 30,000 word piece, what I'm going to be able to cover today is very, very minor. And so many of my responses, especially if they're substantive, might be like, please read these. So I just want to sort of forewarn you, but what I did want to do is give you a little bit of a sketch of how I approach this particular history, which arrays Chavismo as a narrative in an effort to move away from assuming cause and effect ex post facto, which I think is what we tend to do as historians. We have an array of evidence, and we come to an interpretation, and we kind of fit those pieces together with the interpretation that we have arrived to. Instead, what I wanted to do was not presume an outcome in any given moment, but rather to revisit ranges of political opportunities and possibilities at any given moment, understanding that actors in those moments did not know or had no idea, or even if they thought they had an idea, couldn't account for the possible scenarios that might eventually end up, right? So if you place yourself in a moment, say for instance, the coup of April 2002, what would that look like if you don't already know what the answer is, right? And how do you approach that from a perspective of unknowingness and incompleteness? And it's not, of course, a limitless range of political opportunities or options, but it's not prefigured or worse, fated, which I think is a real impulse behind polarized accounts, right? That Chavez, for instance, always knew that his project was going to be authoritarian and therefore started with that in mind. Or the opposition always knew that that Chavismo was going to take this path, and that's why they behaved in the ways that they did. And beyond that, there's also the sense of fatedness that people, the situation in which Venezuela finds itself today is the fault of Venezuelans, and therefore they have to be rendered to their own fate, rather than providing a much more comprehensive sense of being able to draw on of a history that is not complete, that is not dated, and really allows us to consider that nothing is immutable or ineluctable, especially historically, which is especially in context of high polarization when there seems to be no exit out of this particular kind of labyrinth. So it does confront us squarely with the reality that history is a product of decisions whose outcomes are uncertain rather than of fate or of overdetermination. That's ultimately what this particular attempt at writing a comprehensive history of Chavismo hopefully will allow us to do. To think about a non-overdetermined history whose outcomes are and were uncertain, and therefore start from that premise and see what lands. So the broad strokes of Venezuela today, you may all be familiar with. It is now considered a complex humanitarian crisis. It's got the second largest migration in the world, following that of Syria only. The inflation, even though, as I'll talk about in a minute, has been curbed through an ad hoc process of dollarization, reached levels of 350,000%. Massive food shortages, diseases that had long been eradicated have resurfaced, massive amounts of political repression, both at the level of political elites, but also at popular sectors through special repressive apparatuses of the state. Thank you. Yes, I do sweat. I apologize. It's not nerves. It's just, I don't know. I'm from Caracas and we sweat there.
You walked up the hill too.
Yeah, I did also walk up the hill. I appreciate it. So the question is, well, how and why did Venezuela reach this point? And it's this question that is the subject of fierce, polarized debate. For some, the answer lies with Chavez and his eponymous movement, which from the outset, they claim, Chavismo pursued an authoritarian project cloaked in the language of popular democracy, but in fact underlain by cronyism, repression, and spendthrift handouts to the poor. For others, Venezuela's current situation stems from resistance by domestic elites and their backers in the US government. From the start, these people argue, local elites and US officials saw in Chavismo a threat less to democracy than to their power and to their influence at home and in the region. And so these forces then use democratic and anti-democratic means to undermine Chavez's efforts to redistribute wealth, to implement socialism, and to challenge US hegemony in Latin American world. Still others blame the nation's dependence on oil, which for nearly 100 years has lured governments of different ideological stripes into cycles of boom and bust, overspending in times of plenty, only to contend with accumulated economic, social, and political debts in times of scarcity. Now, this particular point is crucial. Taken together, each one of these explanations is accurate. The problem is that they're often deployed independently, creating an incomplete picture of the Chavez era aimed less at explaining than at apportioning or deflecting blame. Now, in part, these incomplete renderings reflect intense polarization that, again, for over 2 decades has turned Venezuelan politics into a winner-take-all conflict between Chavistas and anti-Chavistas. But not just politics, again, interpretations of Venezuelanness, of Venezuelan history, all of it is deeply polarized. More broadly, what these incomplete explanations or these incomplete renderings belie is the complex contingent factors that led to the collapse of one political order, the rise of a new political order, and eventually the onset of one of the worst humanitarian crises in Latin American history. So what I try to do in this particular account of Chavez and Chavismo is to offer an interpretation that emphasizes instead the evolving nature of both Chavez and Chavismo. That it doesn't assume either one of these to be static, but in fact is always changing, dynamic, and for reasons which become extremely important in gesturing at this nature. So, for instance, rather than seeing Chavismo as a break with the past, which is a favorite trope of Chavistas, hardcore Chavistas, everything that happened before Chavez came to power was terrible, was oligarchic, was exclusionary, etc., or by those ardent anti-Chavistas who say like everything that was came before Chavez, there might have been some issues, but really it was inclusive and it was democratic, etc. So rather than seeing Chavismo as a break with the past, it considers how continuities between the Chavez era and the political order that it replaced undermined its own stated efforts to implement revolutionary change. Rather than seeing Chavismo as an authoritarian project from the start, it considers how anti-democratic moves by Chavez and his opponents created opportunities and incentives for cementing state control that Chavismo eagerly seized on and then later suffered from in ways that it both anticipated but then ultimately did not. Rather than, for instance, seeing the United States as an omnipotent force over the region, it understands Chavismo and the international alliances that it formed as agents in their own right, who shaped, responded to, and suffered from larger geopolitical shifts, especially around what we'll talk about in a moment, which is the commodity boom that really exploded around 2003, 2004. And finally, rather than seeing oil as the main driver of Venezuelan politics and society, it considers how highs and lows in commodity prices exacerbated rather than created already deep contradictions within the heart of Chavismo. So taking all these assumptions, which are quite tropish in the way that Venezuelan history in the last 25 years have been rendered, like leaning into those and thinking, well, how might it look differently if we don't make some of those assumptions? So seen as a whole, Chavismo takes shape less as a single movement linked by an overriding ideology than as an assemblage of often contradictory movements and ideologies that developed in what I describe as 4 distinct stages. And thinking about stages is helpful in terms of schematically laying out some deeper modes of change without falling into the trap of episodes, right? Rather than saying something begins and ends very dramatically, one leads into the next. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest thinking about Chavismo in terms of stages. Ken Roberts here has done so in other contexts. Margarita Lopez Maya, Venezuelan historian, has done so as well. But the way that I'm thinking about stages in this particular case, again, in terms of the comprehensive depolarizing history, is that each one of these stages feeds into the next in ways that are often unpredictable. And so rather than assuming predictability, it's the opposite that's at stake. So a first stage preceded Chavez's first electoral triumph in 1998, which brought the collapse of one political order, the so-called Punto Fijo system of liberal democratic two-party rule, which was in place since 1958, and then the slow emergence of an inchoate alternative order. But what are the origins and foundations of this alternative order? It's not a self-evident question, as you might think. For some, for instance, to seek Chavismo's foundations is to grant it legitimacy or structure that it lacked at its outset. Instead, they argue it should be understood primarily in opportunistic terms as a populist movement filling a vacuum left by the fast waning legitimacy of the old order. What I outline instead is a twin process, whereby Chavismo's rise and early configuration inversely mirrored Punto Fijo's decline. Both of these need to be understood in relation to each other as a way to see how they are not only interlinked, but really symbiotically related. So one process comprises the climax, crisis, and collapse of the political order which was in power in the 40 years preceding Chavez's first election. Now, understanding the contours of what I call in the piece this epic of Punto Fijo importantly shapes the way that we should understand the system that followed, at least the early stages of Chavismo. After 1958, when the last military dictatorship in Venezuela in the 20th century was overthrown, Venezuela over time became seen as an exceptional nation, exceptional relative to the rest of Latin America. It had a largely stable political system in contrast to other parts of the region. It was not led by a military dictatorship. It was not racked by a civil war. After a 1960s period of internal guerrilla strife, which was defeated and then successfully integrated into the political process, it really came to be seen as a standalone kind of model in the region. And in the 70s, in particular, was the apogee of this Punto Fijo regime. This was a moment when Venezuela, as an oil country, benefited massively from the embargo of 1973, which brought massive amounts of money into the coffers of the Venezuelan state, just at a moment when it had consolidated itself quite successfully, and therefore led to the nationalization of the oil industry into a company that became known as PDVSA. Now, it's important in this moment not to see it just as a crowning achievement of this model, but also the way that PDVSA was privatized would have huge consequences for the future of Chavismo. In particular, because when it was privatized, PDVSA was largely a quasi-private, autonomous company, which paid dividends to the state, but otherwise privileged technical expertise focused on exporting and producing oil, which is to say that its remit to the state was singularly focused on producing, exporting oil, and paying dividends to the state. Over time, this became seen as kind of a state within a state, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it, of course, provided significant amounts of revenue for the government. But by the 1980s, this system entered into agony. The 70s had been an apogee, the 70s was agony in the context of two twin crises. The first was economic. By 1982, the prices, which had risen exponentially in the 1970s, declined just as exponentially, which left Venezuela saddled with massive amounts of debt. There was also a global financial crisis as other debtor nations, specifically Mexico, defaulted on their debts, and therefore credit markets dried up, which Venezuela had relied on to be able to continue to finance its expenditures. But the debt crisis and the oil bust also highlighted and showcased what the oil boom of the 1970s had masked, which was massive amounts of corruption, right? So the entry of oil revenue, petrodollars in the 1970s was such that corruption could both sustain and also be masked the growth that was taking place. The other thing that was masked during the 1970s period of oil boom was inequality. The way that these revenues were being distributed was unequal, and therefore massive amounts of expectations were created, especially among popular sectors. Ultimately, the economic crisis of the 1980s led to austerity, privatization, structural adjustments, devaluation of currencies, etc., which disproportionately hurt both the middle classes and popular sectors. But the second crisis of this 1980s was political. The oil boom had concentrated power in the executive and raised expectations about what the state could and should deliver, which of course was now untenable in the context of an oil bust. So this led to a vicious cycle. So as austerity policies swelled the ranks of the poor and squeezed the middle class, mounting grievances fell on a political system, the national government, major parties, and elected officials that were ever less able to respond, which therefore eroded confidence in a political order ever more committed to austerity to weather the financial storm. This came to a head, these twin crises of economic downturn and political legitimacy, in 1989, first in what was known as the Caracazo riots, which was a moment of popular protest in response to a series of neoliberal structural adjustment policies implemented that year, which the state responded to with significant amounts of repression, which therefore also broke the pact, the social pact between what had been the government, liberal representative government, and the people that it ascended to represent. But the second crisis was of decentralization. Direct local elections happened for the first time in Venezuela in 1989 in the wake of the Caracazo, and these should have been a high point in any political system, where now suddenly you can elect mayors and governors, etc. But in the context of austerity, decentralization offered greater representation, but with little economic power, undermining rather than bolstering popular belief in democratic accountability. Great, I can now vote on my mayor, I can now vote on my governor, but the mayor and the government has no actual economic wherewithal to do any of the things that I would want them to do. So therefore, this erodes even more democratic accountability. So the combined impact of these reforms, which were meant to generate confidence in representative rule, instead had the opposite effect. They eroded faith in the promises of the liberal democratic order, which had been founded in 1958. This came to a head in 1992 in the coup that Chavez staged in February of 1992, which punctured the social pact between leaders and populace, but more importantly, what it revealed were deep fissures not only between popular sectors in the state, but now within the pacted system itself. Political elites were now also implicated in the process of not really believing in the system that they had generated, especially among the ranks of the military. What that led to in the case of the 90s was the last gaps of the Trujillo regime. A president who had been elected in the late 1960s, early 1970s, returned as president, but now no longer part of the two-party hegemony system that had been created, which therefore signaled the emergence of an electoral politics which was based much more on personal appeal than on party or ideological affiliation. And of course, this would basically be the entryway for somebody like Chavez to enter into the picture. It also exposed how Punto Fijo failed to cultivate a new generation of political leaders to represent a changing electorate. The second sort of last gasp was a banking crisis in 1995 and 1996, which led to half of the banks in Venezuela failing, and many of those who led those banks to flee Venezuela with untold millions of dollars, which meant that for Venezuelans, especially middle-class Venezuelans, there was a sense that the state could not even minimally oversee the very private sector that they had built as the answer to Venezuela's problems. And then the final death blow of this particular system was the reprivatization of PDVSA through a system of what was called apertura, to re-welcome private investment in the oil sector, which in the context of what had been the crowning achievement of Punto Fijo in the 1950s or in the 1970s now seemed like a complete reversal of those fortunes. This is, again, sort of the larger context and backdrop within which the second process, the inverse process of the rise of Chavez in particular, Chavismo, takes place. This is what I call Chavismo as Bolivarian revolution in this particular phase. So against this backdrop, it made sense that Chavismo became the standard bearer for political change. In important ways, he embodied the achievements and the shortcomings of the Punto Fijo era. He had been born in 1954, part of a generation of Venezuelans raised in the fray of the 1960s democratic consolidation. He came of age during the 1980s, during the 1970s, and grew into political consciousness in a climate of deep political unrest in the 1980s. He was dark-hued, brought up in a family of modest means in the country's long impoverished cattle ranching Llanos region. His background therefore stood apart from many of the nation's political and economic elites, and more closely reflected the plight of the growing ranks of Venezuela's poor, mestizo, disenfranchised, etc. But Chavez had also deeply benefited from opportunities for advancement provided by liberal democracy. In 1971, he joined the professionalized military and rose through its ranks to secure an education and middle-class status. Like many upwardly mobile Venezuelans in the 1970s oil boom, Chavez also harbored deep affinity for U.S. popular culture, in his case rooted in dreams of playing Major League Baseball. Yet as a child of the Llanos, the Plains region, a region which was steeped in folklore as the cradle of Venezuelan independence, he also nurtured a strong nationalist streak that deeply informed his sense of self. So all these kind of contradictory features would coalesce around an inchoate political identity that combined three elements. The first was reformist militarism. As a cadet in the military, Chavez made official visits to Panama and to Peru, where the dictatorships of General Omar Torrijos and Juan Velasco Alvarado, respectively, had begun implementing land reform and other programs aimed at breaking the power of entrenched economic and political sectors, often backed by the United States, in favor of long marginalized sectors. The second feature of this Bolivarian revolution was revolutionary vanguardism. Chavez's first command after graduating from the military academy was to seek out and destroy the vestiges of guerrillas, Marxist guerrillas that had been banding about in the 1960s and 1970s. Tactically, this was not a big issue. There were very few of them around. But against the backdrop of an oil boom fueled corruption in the 1970s and growing inequality in the late 1970s, guerrillas' critiques of capitalism resonated with Chavez, in part because it was a message that he had heard via his older brother, Adan Chavez, who had socialist affinities and associations, and who ultimately introduced Chavez, who was increasingly disgruntled as a young officer, to the guerrilla leadership and to their own vanguardist vision of revolution. In turn, it was the guerrillas during the time that helped persuade Chavez, who was contemplating leaving the army, that he could accomplish more to revolutionize the state from within than from outside. So this created the sense of a revolutionary vanguardism at play. The final element of this early vision of Chavismo was Bolivarian nationalism. So insurgents, especially the guerrilla, had largely eschewed nationalist appeals in favor of a much more rigid message about class struggle. But by contrast, Chavez drew heavily on Venezuelan history, particularly what the Venezuelan historian Germán Carrera Damas called Venezuelans' cult to Bolivar. to uphold the vision not only of Venezuelan, but of continental unity and greatness. Right? So in all these ways, he was a little bit similar to existing patterns of the 16 dynamics, but also creating something entirely different. And that's what gave rise to the movement that he eventually called the MBR 200, the Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario, which was importantly a non-electoral and non-civilian movement. It was a military movement made to seize power and eventually create the foundations for what would be a more inclusive, eventually democratic state. The Caracazo in this context was a catalyst for this movement, but they were not ready at the time. And by 1992, when they did stage their coup and it was defeated, it was in the context of being able to speak about the coup after he was arrested that the first really coming of into stage of Chavez into popular consciousness came into being. And it was important because the coup had two contradictory effects. On the one hand, Chavez stood apart from many of the country's leaders. He cut a familiar figure among Venezuela's darker-skinned poor majority, many of them who had been rural migrants to urban centers like Chavez. Of course, and also undertaking this high-risk strategy and assuming responsibility for the coup's failure, he seemed to exhibit a humility that was rare among the political elite. And also, in speaking of the unmet promises of pacted democracy and laying open the possibility of future change in nationalist terms, he captured the imagination of many, not just among the poor, but also middle classes, who had borne the brunt of the country's turn to IMF and post-austerity, whether, again, working class or middle class. On the other hand, the coup and a follow-up coup in November failed to rally any kind of popular support. Not for lack of trying. In the second coup, Chavez, through a clandestinely circulated videotape that was played on television, tried to get people to rally to the cause. But nobody did, or very few did. So both attempts indicated that while Venezuelans may have found merit in the conspirators' messages, they rejected their methods, opting instead, as they had since the 1960s, for elections as the main avenue to pursue political change. This ultimately is what led to an electoral strategy, an ex post facto electoral strategy on the part of Chavez and Chavismo, especially with the foundation of the MBR, the Movimiento Quinta República, or the Fifth Republic movement, which was wordplay meant to capitalize on the name recognition of the MBR. So this was the MBR, so there was a kind of interesting wordplay there. But it also gestured at a political project that sought to found the republic anew, a revolutionary project in kind of Arendtian terms that starts history anew, after the failure of 4 previous attempts at independence, most recently Punto Fijo. It also transposed the ideological underpinnings of the MBR 200, reformist militarism, revolutionary vanguardism, and Bolivarian nationalism around a diffuse call for a Bolivarian revolution that further crystallized its radical political pretensions. But the MBR was much more of an electoral vehicle than a political party. It was purposely vague on specific policy in order to allow voters with wide-ranging, even contradictory critiques of the political system to project their aspirations onto Chavez. And so Chavez centered its campaign around 3 general principles with cross-cutting appeal: combating corruption, rolling back austerity, and promoting democratic participation. All of them converging around a call to convene a constituent assembly and to rewrite the constitution, reflecting what was now going to be a new Venezuela. So at first, the outreach and support grew to include not only many among the country's poor, but because many could project their aspirations onto this vague platform, also middle classes and even some business leaders who considered change not only inevitable, but believed that they could better exert pressure upon it and its direction as allies rather than as antagonists, which led to this broad-based movement that often is elided in recountings of the Chavez's coming to power. And he won in a landslide, but the vote in 1998 revealed a polarized society as over 40% of Venezuelans supported a candidate that aimed to reform rather than to replace the political system. Moreover, behind Chavez's electoral support lay major contradictions. His strongest voter base was indeed among the country's poor, but it also included many among the middle classes seeking major political change. But what did they expect? For the former, popular sectors, a strong state that privileged the pursuit of social and economic rights for the country's poor was paramount. For the latter, for middle classes, bolstering civil and political rights in order to achieve true rule of law and representative democracy took precedence. Now, Chavez appealed to both, but in the context of heightened expectations, depolarization, implementing these two priorities would reveal them to be actually at cross purposes, setting up a battle less over democracy than what the late anthropologist Fernando Bonilla has called competing meanings of democracy that would shape Chavismo's first years in power. And this is the second stage. And this is interesting because often what's understood as the beginnings of Chavismo start in 1998, but I understand it as a second stage, which is Chavismo no longer as Bolivarian revolution, rather as participatory democracy. A period that lasts from between 1999 to around 2006. And it's marked by these pitched battles between Chavistas and anti-Chavistas, again, over competing meanings of democracy and culminating in the consolidation of Chavez in power. Again, Chavez had reached the presidency at the head of a Bolivarian revolution that promised to refound the republic. Yet from the outset, his plans for sweeping change faced three major challenges. The first was punto fijo. He did not come to power by revolutionary means, meaning through the gun, and as a result, the entire vestiges, the entire apparatus of the existing, the prior system remained, which meant that he had to figure out ways to get rid of it. The economy posed a second challenge. Of course, Chavismo had promised to roll back structural adjustment reforms and rebuild state capacity, but when he first came to office, the price per barrel of oil was $8 a barrel. It would rise eventually to upwards of $150 a barrel by 2010. But earlier on, there was no economic wherewithal for this to actually take place. The third challenge was Chavismo itself. It had been this heterogeneous movement that brought him to power to try to find some cohesion within it that could articulate a shared vision for what could come next was extremely, extremely difficult. And Chavez approached each one of these challenges through a form of plebiscitary politics that he called participatory democracy. In particular, this is concentrated and coalesced around the call for and eventually the passing of a new constitution, which combined two contradictory elements. On the one, it had greater executive control than any previous constitution, but it also included many more capacities for plebiscitary participation, especially through referenda. So accentuating executive control, but allowing for greater participation through referenda created this dynamic where what was absolutely necessary in order to continue to remain in power was through the mobilization, continuous mobilization of popular support. This was of course, the moment at which Chavez was also reelected for a 6-year term in 2000. It also granted him significant legislative power when his allies swept Congress in 2000. It also created the opportunity for him to begin to rebuild state capacity by convening OPEC heads of state as a way to reclaim a sense of OPEC with teeth. It was also a way to challenge the Washington consensus and therefore to bring Venezuela into a collision course with the United States government. But at the same time, this led to massive amounts of reaction. Right? Those who had previously seen themselves as on the margins, especially those who are in the middle classes who are now seeing this concentration of power as problematic, begin over 2002 to 2004 to stage a series of differently structured challenges to Chavismo. The first challenge is insurrectional through the April 2002 coup. And the significance of this April 2002 coup is that it challenged the sense that the opposition could and was, in fact, a democratic alternative to Chavismo. By staging this coup, there was no longer the claim that they could, in fact, represent, at least for some sectors of the opposition, a democratic alternative. The second significant feature of the opposition reaction to Chavismo during the stage was an abstentionist wing. So the idea that we could, in fact, participate electorally was challenged when the opposition in 2004 staged a referendum, but following that referendum refused to accept the results. And the idea being that if we're not going to participate, or if we do participate, we're not going to actually be able to win, and therefore creates an abstentionist wing that is eventually going to be another significant feature of the opposition. But there was a third wing of the opposition that emerged during this time, which was an electoral wing. This electoral wing suggested that the way to reclaim power was through doing the work of actually rebuilding popular support among those who opposed Chavismo. The issue is that these three sectors of the opposition that were forged during this period of 2002-2004 would again and again take center stage in a battle that inhibited unity among the opposition rather than creating some sort of concerted effort. All which was to say that after Chavismo was able to best these three challenges during the period of reaction, what was left was a period of consolidation between 2004 and 2006. And this consolidation took shape in three particular ways. The first was through the establishment of parallel structures. So how do we get rid of Punto Fijo? Rather than attacking it directly, we're going to build parallel institutions, especially through social missions or social programs, which we call misiones sociales. This was facilitated by oil boom. This commodity boom, which the Iraq war had helped to facilitate, but also massive growth in the part of China, especially around commodities, allowed Venezuelan oil with other nations in Latin America to now turn to have significant wherewithal that they didn't have before. This created a geopolitical shift in the region, which we now understand as the pink tide, which allowed Chavez to have allies, whereas before he had primarily only enemies. Finally, the moment of deep consolidation came in 2005, when the opposition, again, this abstentionist wing of the opposition, boycotted parliamentary elections and basically gave carte blanche to Chavez and Chavismo to have complete rule of the institutional apparatus. With this in mind, with flush in resources, with a favorable geopolitical landscape, and with full institutional control, he was reelected to a new term of office in 2006. The challenge here, though, is that by 2006, both Venezuela, I know we're running a little bit late, let me try to summarize it quickly. By 2006, the challenge that Chavismo faced was no longer external, it was now internal to Chavismo itself. And this is the moment at which the contradictions that had long been simmering will rise to the surface. The first is that Chavez himself transformed from what had again previously been his Bolivarian, diffuse, vague ideology to now much more rooted in what he called 21st century socialism. So no longer was Bolivarianism the north, as it were, but now was this vague sense of 21st century socialism. Regional geopolitics also changed. Yes, there were now many more left-wing allies, but the left in Latin America was not one and the same, with many different characteristics. Some lefts were far more institutionally minded, others were far less institutionally minded. So by seeing the left as one, it really complicates our understanding of what this period of geopolitical opportunity was like for Chavismo at its moment of highest power. Chavismo was also massively wealthy. It had the greatest windfall of revenues, petrodollars that it had ever seen. But this created a contradiction of its own. It could spend not only with reckless abandon, but could do so without any kind of checks to its power, and with any kind of accountability. And also in a context of depolarization, where the only thing that mattered was to stay in power. And so overspending had to happen in order for Chavismo to stay in power, but doing so also required being unable to actually have any kind of accountability at the end. All these various features is what led eventually to the erosion of Chavismo's power internally, because it continued not only to see itself and its mission as primarily only to stay in power, rather than to create a sustainable vision of political power that could outlast it. And of course, this was absolutely significant when Chavez, the eponym of Chavismo, died in 2013, and Maduro, his hand-picked successor, came to power. And this is what I understand is the fourth and final stage of Chavismo, which is Chavismo as Madridismo. And the question here is Chavismo as Madridismo a change to Chavez and Chavismo as it was before, or is it the consummation, the final expression of Chavismo? And this tension is what I try to capture in the piece, which basically articulates all the accumulated contradictions of the earlier Chavista eras and stages as now happening and exploding in a context where there is no money, where no longer did Chavismo have institutional control, at least in a democratically legitimate way, and so therefore it has to resort primarily and increasingly to repression in order to survive. Okay, and with this, I will end, and with the apologies that everything is in the piece in much longer form in the following way. So the context within which we find ourselves in Venezuela today is one where hyperinflation that I talked about before has ended, but the shift happened through an ad hoc dollarization process, which was anchored in tremendous inequality. As it's mainly that those with access to dollars, whether through state corruption, remittances, or entrepreneurship, who can participate in an incipient economic recovery. And the oil production has recovered somewhat after dropping precipitously with aid from Iran and China and other countries, at times topping 1 million barrels a day. The industry's collapse under the weight of mismanagement, coupled with the disastrous impact of severe U.S. sanctions on both the oil industry and the government's ability to seek foreign financing, spurred a cash-strapped Maduro to open environmentally fragile regions of the Amazon for extracting gold and other minerals to pay both its inner circle to stay in power and also allies abroad. At the same time, hamstrung by both direct and indirect forms of state repression and persistently caught in its own long-standing divisions over strategy and tactics to reclaim power, today's opposition movement is weak as it has ever been, disconnected from most Venezuelans and with no independent vision for the future. And while state capacity has risen as the economy stabilizes and the government resumes small forms of investment, it is rebuilding from historic lows in a context where social and economic equity, much less political participation, are no longer priorities. So for now, the crisis cycle that was nominally ushered in with Chavez's death has come to a close. After nearly a decade of bitter domestic and geopolitical conflict, Madurismo is firmly entrenched and early signs of limited economic recovery are afoot. But the price of keeping power was any vestige of Chavismo's social and economic gains and the promise of a political system that was more attentive to the needs of those who were formerly sidelined by Grupo Fijo. Today, very little, if anything, remains of Chavismo's either Bolivarian, participatory, or even socialist strains. What does stand in place is an authoritarian reality that was always present in the heart of the movement, but for years was kept in productive tension with democratizing impulses from elsewhere within Chavismo. The return of these democratizing currents appears unlikely, but it's certainly not implausible. For that, in the end, is what has long defined Chavismo. Not ideology, but adaptation and survival. As long as it remains in power, Chavismo is likely to reinvent itself anew. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.